In this episode, we're going to look at a very unique CoCo 3 that is in my collection. You'll notice right away that the keyboard is physically separated from the case. You'll also notice that there are cables where you wouldn't expect. There's an opening where the keyboard was, and there are wires running around inside as well. This is not your typical CoCo 3. This has been heavily modified and was once owned by CoCo luminary Marty Goodman. Later in the episode, I'll touch on how I got this particular CoCo 3, as well as Marty's penchant for modifying CoCo 3s like this. But first, let's take a look in more detail at the system. I've turned this CoCo 3 over and we're looking at the bottom of the case. The first thing you'll notice is that there's this ribbon cable coming out conspicuously from the inside bottom and plugged into the lower left-hand side where the 10-pin RGB analog monitor connector is. I'll show you why that cable is there in just a bit. But let's take a look at the sticker. This is a 128K Color Computer 3 with a model number of 26-3334, just like all CoCo 3s, and a serial number of 1016746. This CoCo 3 was made in Korea. When CoCo 3s were manufactured starting in 1985 to 1986, they started out being made in Korea, and a couple of years later in 1988, Tandy moved the manufacturing back to the United States. So this is definitely an early CoCo 3. I'll start out by taking the top off of this CoCo 3, move the keyboard out the way, and there are no screws, so the top just lifts off. There's nothing under the top, nothing exceptional except this badge here. This is a custom badge that I placed because there was nothing really in that area when I got the CoCo 3. The keyboard connector is here. We'll look at that up close in a bit. Ties into the keyboard connector on the motherboard, and there's the RGB monitor connector. Taking the top off of this CoCo 3, the first thing you'll notice is that it is heavily modified. There is a lot going on here. Every chip has pretty much been replaced and socketed. There is not a chip on here that isn't in a socket, with the exception of one or two chips. The CPU is socketed, the PIA chips are socketed, the ROM is socketed. Lots of stuff has been redone here. There's also the ribbon cable going to the keyboard and to the analog RGB port that I'll talk about in just a bit. And there's also a wire, or set of wires, going to the reset port. And it looks like the ROM is a custom ROM of sorts. Looks like some modifications probably were done to the ROM code. The Gimme chip is a 1987 Gimme, so it's the later variant of that particular integrated circuit. And the RAM upgrade in here is the Performance Peripherals 512K, which has been around since around 1986 or 1987. I'm going to speculate that Marty probably made these modifications in order to do testing. He, of course, wrote a column for the Rainbow and did a lot of hardware hacking and stuff. So he probably used this as a workhorse CoCo 3 on his bench and could easily swap in and out parts and chips as needed to try different things. Focusing on the front of the CoCo is this 16-pin connector from this ribbon cable here that is part of the external keyboard. That, of course, goes into the connector on the CoCo 3. We have the ribbon cable here, which is going from the bottom of the RGB connector out to the side so that you can conveniently plug in an RGB connector. And this board appears to be a custom-made board with the ribbon cable going in and a slot for the original Mylar keyboard, it looks like, although none is connected. I'll put it back here in position. Alright, so that kind of covers the custom mods on this board. Here's the memory upgrade. We're going to take a look at that up close shortly, and of course the CPU and all of the other chips are all socketed on this board. It's very interesting. And the Gimme, of course, and the ROM. Looking up close at the motherboard, the ROM is custom. Bugs, B-U-G-Z, with an address range and absolute, so this must be a custom ROM of sorts. The Gimme is a 1987 Tandy variant from Mexico, so it's newer. The two PIA chips are socketed, as is the salt chip here. The performance peripherals 512K RAM upgrade, of course, is installed here. And moving over to the right, the CPU and this other chip is socketed, and this wire, this yellow and black wire, runs from the reset connector down to the external keyboard, so you can conveniently reset the CoCo from that keyboard. Here's a closer look at the 16-pin keyboard connector on the front, as well as the 10-pin analog RGB connector on the side. And this is the reset switch that you can use to reset the CoCo. That's the black and yellow wire that we just saw in the previous clip. So you press this button and you can actually reset the CoCo from the keyboard, extended some feet from the actual machine. I've hooked up the CoCo 3 to the composite video, and I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Reset. And what you see is bugs on the screen, not your typical CoCo 3 Musketeers picture, which indicates that Marty did indeed modify this ROM. Now I'm going to put the CoCo 3 into high speed mode so that I can talk to the DriveWire server at 115.2. And I'm going to run a memory stress test program that I downloaded off the internet. This stress test program has been around for quite a few years. It's very good. It's specifically for the CoCo 3. Written by Richard Goodman. Going to scroll through here, and it just talks about what the test does. And essentially it will detect how much RAM is in the CoCo 3. It will put that up, and it will start running through a series of bit patterns throughout the RAM in order to really stress the RAM out and make sure that what is being written into the RAM is read back out properly. So a normal, standard memory stress test program, specifically for the CoCo 3 in this case, and there we go. So it's already detected that it's 512K of RAM, testing various pages, and it'll just go through here. There we go, showing some different patterns and so forth. While it's doing that, I want to talk about the provenance of this CoCo 3. Obviously, this is a Marty Goodman modified CoCo 3, but it's not the only one in the world. There are at least a couple of more out there that are in the hands of collectors. And I got this CoCo 3 by way of Tim Lindner, who had, I believe, intercepted the collection from Marty Goodman some years back and distributed at least a couple of these CoCos out to the wild. So I've been having this CoCo 3 for probably about 4 or 5 years. I'm speeding up the video here so that we go through the RAM test at least over the video a lot quicker. It's going to write a bunch of these patterns and do this again over and over, stressing out the RAM, but I'm pretty confident that on this CoCo 3, with this quality of memory upgrade, the performance peripherals, which by the way was a stellar upgrade for its time back in the heyday of the CoCo 3, is working pretty good. I'll demonstrate the utility of the reset button that's mounted on the back of this keyboard. I'll do the Control-Alt-Reset trick on the CoCo 3. There's the button. I'll hold down Control-Alt. There's the bug screen, reset screen, and I just reset it back. So, pretty handy. As I've done on other CoCo collector videos, I'm going to load in the Joy Test program into this CoCo 3 with two Black Beauty joysticks hooked up to the joystick ports, just to ensure that those are working. I'm going to use Sound Studio here to play and load in the Joy Test program. Then I'll run it. And as you can see, I'm moving around the left joystick, pressing the button, the fire button on the right will change the 0 to a 1. I'll do the same thing for the right joystick, and it seems that the values are indeed changing as I would expect. So I would say the joystick ports are working fine on this Marty Goodman edition CoCo 3. That wraps up this edition of the CoCo Collector. We looked at the CoCo 3 modified by Marty Goodman, and it seems to be in great shape. So I'll give it a thumbs up.